You're listening to an After Dinner Conversation magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we have created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Audiobooks, provides audiobook recordings of stories that have appeared in our magazine, and our companion podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kinds of discussions we hope you're having about these readings with friends, family, or students. We would love it if you went over to check it out. I'm Roberta, your narrator and story editor at After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/afterdinnerconversation. And of course, if you enjoy this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. Today's story is In Love and War, written by Veronica Leigh and published in our June 2021 magazine. In Love and War by Veronica Leigh. April 1943 in Krakow, Poland. Irene was bent over her needlework, stitching the frayed seam of her skirt when she heard a single gunshot ring out. She jerked and then scowled. After 4 years of war, she ought to be used to it. Why, the other night a bullet penetrated through her wall while she slumbered. Had it not been for a volume of Slovatsky's poems on the bookshelf which shielded her, she would have been another civilian fatality. How long would it have taken for someone to find me? Irene frowned. Her world was small. She lived alone in a one-room cottage, and she never deviated from her routine of work, errands, and church. Draping the finished garment over the arm of the chair, she stretched and yawned. It was nearly midnight, and she would have to be at the enamel factory early. As the cleaning lady, she was hardly essential to the war effort, but she kept everything tidy. Her pay was barely enough for food and for her to make rent every month, but she managed to survive. Survive, that was the key word. She longed for better times when she didn't have to worry whether or not she would end up on the streets. There were moments when she truly hated herself. But she often had to sin to survive, stealing, buying off the black market, spending the night with her employer to receive better wages, all to survive. She weakly confessed her sins to the priest, but the guilt was still there, and she was no better off. Irene changed into her nightgown, scrubbed her face, and ran a brush through her blonde tresses, combing until it shined. She moved the candle to the nightstand and knelt to say her customary prayers. Then after blowing the candle out, Irene slid beneath the covers and scooted down into the mattress. A frantic knock sounded on her door. Oh, go away! She yanked the sheet over her head, but the pounding continued. It could be the Germans. Bolding upright in her bed, her heart nearly stopped. She rationalized that she had done nothing wrong and had nothing to fear. However, that never made much difference to the Nazis. They never needed a reason to arrest someone. Irene crossed herself, rushed to the door, and eased it open. A shadowy figure barged in, knocking her aside. The intruder shoved the door closed. Who are you? What do you want? Irene yelped and fumbled for the doorknob, but the stranger jerked her away and pushed her against the wall. He clamped his hands over her mouth. The pressure on her lips prevented her from crying out. Don't scream, the man commanded, his voice racked with panic. I need help. Her eyes adjusted to the dark, and she was able to make out his face. He was near her age, strong and tall, and obviously on the run from the Germans. He must be part of the resistance, Irene deduced. While the Nazis reigned over Poland with an iron fist, the Polish resistance refused to surrender. Groups of young men and women operated clandestinely, risking their lives to follow their conscience. They were Poland's unsung heroes. No matter the danger he put her in, she could not abandon her countrymen in his time of need. Irene nodded meekly. The man eased his hand off and took a step back. Irene retrieved the candle and relit it. Who are you? She demanded. He made no response, other than a small moan. Focusing her gaze on him, she gasped. Blood had soaked through one of his white shirt sleeves. A stream ran down his arm, dripping into a puddle on the floor. Irene grasped his shoulder and propelled him into the bed. Once stretched out, she tore open the soiled material. The flesh of his bicep had been snagged, but when she stuck her finger into the gash, she felt no bullet or shrapnel. It was nothing more than a scrape, but a deep one at that. His eyes protruded from their sockets, and ragged breaths wheezed from his quivering lips. The more he panicked, the faster his blood flowed. "Shh! Calm now," Irene ordered. "Think of something pleasant. Think of Chopin's Impromptu." To help him along, she hummed the wistful tune, and soon he joined in, and his breathing evened out. She fetched the basin of water, towels, and an old bottle of vodka, along with the darning needle and thread she used earlier on her skirt. Passing the bottle to him, she directed, "Drink this. It should take the edge off." He pinned her down with his piercing blue eyes, but he did as she instructed and chugged a hearty gulp. Then she grabbed the bottle and took a swig to steady her own nerves. Irene folded a towel and wedged it between his teeth so he would not bite his tongue. She wiped off the excess blood and bathed the area before splashing a plentiful amount of the drink on his wound. He gave a hoarse shout, but the cry was muted by the cloth. Holding the pointed end of the needle to the flame, she hoped it was sterilized enough. Threading the eye of the needle, she muttered a prayer to the Holy Mother to guide her nimble fingers. She tried to envision his skin as nothing more than a split seam, like the one on her skirt. The man trembled from the inside out as she pierced his flesh with the needle and sewed the folds of skin back together. In and out, over and over again. The slim bit of metal punctured through, as though his flesh were a flimsy piece of leather. When she finished, she snipped the thread and grimaced at the matted mess. "It would be a miracle if it does not become infected or doesn't rip back open," Irene concluded as she wiped off the blood that had caked on her fingers. Flecks of red had dried on her nightgown, but there was no point in changing since she had no other nightgowns to change into. His shaking subsided, and his breathing had grown shallow enough that she feared he was slipping away. Irene touched his brow and smoothed back his damp blondish hair. Warmth radiated from his face. There was still life in him. A handsome man, he had a broad forehead embroidered by neatly trimmed eyebrows. "Max." His delicately curved lips formed into a bemused smile. "What?" Irene blinked her confusion. "Max is my name." He stared at her through his hooded cornflower-blue depths. "I apologize for forcing my way in, but the Germans would have killed me if they had found me." He continued to look a little sheepish. "The blackout curtain in your window had come loose, and I saw the light. I hoped that you would help me. I was desperate." "Don't worry," she waved him off. "You are welcome to stay as long as you would like." "I shouldn't. If the Germans find me, you will be put to death." "No one knows you are here, and on the off chance someone does figure it out, I can tell them you are my lover. No one will know you are part of the resistance." "I would consider that the highest compliment, to be your lover, especially after you saved my life. But I am not a resistance fighter." Max slid his hand down into his trousers pocket and extracted a white cloth. There was a blue six-pointed star in the center. "I am a Jew." Irene crossed herself once more. Having a Jewish man in her house, although she had been unaware of his heritage, was cause enough for the Germans to take her out and shoot her. "Please." Max's face crumbled, surrendering to his pain. "I beg of you, don't turn me in. I will be gone by morning. You will never have to see me again." Irene chewed on her lower lip. "All right, but you must be gone before sunrise." She dragged the chair over to the bedside and watched as he began to drift off. "So Max is Jewish," she shrugged. He had a good face. With such Nordic features, he could have easily passed for a Christian, perhaps even a German, if he worked on his accent. Krakow's Jewish ghetto had been liquidated in early March. Whoever wasn't killed or deported was taken to the Platzau camp. No one in Krakow could deny knowing the Jews' plight. People simply feigned ignorance. When the trains came through on Sunday mornings, the parishioners just sang louder in church. A pang of guilt coiled and settled low in her belly. She, too, had looked the other way, convincing herself that she had nothing to do with the Jewish people. Not that she had ever bought into the Germans' rabid propaganda, that the Jews were subhuman or needed to be eradicated. It was easier to go about her business. After all, she didn't want to die. Helping a member of the Polish resistance was a different matter entirely. Folks, herself included, were more inclined to help a resistance fighter. The fighters were one of their own, but a Jewish man. Somehow Max had survived the liquidation and escaped being sent to Plaszow, the small concentration camp. For him to approach her for help was foolish. Jewish people never knew who they could trust, who would not hand them over to the Gestapo. The Nazis handsomely rewarded those who betrayed Jews. 500 zlotys a head was the standard payment for betraying a Jew to the Gestapo, or so she last heard. "What's your name?" Irene hadn't realized that she started to doze until she heard Max's raspy question. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was near 2. She rubbed her eyes and looked down at him. Max was half asleep, his lids sagging, but he fought to stay awake. "Irina," she mumbled, "so you escaped the liquidation?" "Yes. I sneaked out through the sewers before the liquidation began, and a priest hid me. I had to leave because my hiding place was compromised. The Germans nearly caught me and shot at me, but I crawled underneath a lorry until it was safe to come out. Then I found you." His voice wavered as a large tear rolled back into his hairline. "I think I must be the last Jew alive in Krakow, maybe even Poland. I should have died with the rest of them." "You must have family somewhere." "Not any more. My wife died of typhus." His gaze settled on her right hand. "Where is your husband?" "Don't know." Irene twisted her wedding band around her finger. The ring had become part of her, like a second skin. She never removed it, not even when she washed dishes or bathed. She often forgot that she was wearing it. "He never came home after defending our country. I worry that he was among those at Katyn. He was an officer." Earlier that month, mass graves were discovered near the Katyn forest, graves of Polish soldiers. The Russians blamed the Germans blamed the Russians, and the deceased Polish men were forgotten, and their families could not mourn them properly. Her husband Andrei had been a lieutenant, and he had been sent to the east to fight, to defend Poland against the Russians when they invaded. That much she knew. Then some of his personal effects had been mailed to her, but there was no confirmation on whether he lived or died. No word at all. No, deep down she did know. Andrei was dead, and had been dead for a few years, but it pained her too much to admit it. "I am sorry." Max heaved a sigh. "No children?" "No, none at all." Irina once mourned that she and Andrei had not had children. Now that Andrei was gone, she was alone, and the war raged on. It was for the best. "I am alone." "Then we are 2 lost souls cursed to roam the earth until death claims us." How very dramatic. She tapped her chin in contemplation. "You were a writer or a teacher?" "A journalist," he nodded. "But that was a lifetime ago." A lone tear trickled down Irina's cheek. She never broke down, not since her husband went missing. Her tears had flowed for days, leaving her to feel raw. Once she regained control of her emotions, she hadn't cried since. Until now. Something about Max and his story stirred something within her, feelings that had long lain dormant. He too had lost a spouse and was alone in the world. She hated being vulnerable. Raising his good arm, Max disregarded his own pain, crooked his finger, and caught the droplet before it fell. Her eyes locked with his, and releasing a small cry, Irina leaned forward and briefly pressed her lips to his. The kiss wasn't a lover's kiss as much as it was her searching for a balm for her lonely soul. He took her hand and tugged on it until she joined him in bed, and he was not content until she rested her head on his shoulder. In another time and in another place, she could have fallen in love with Max, but it was too late now. She drifted off, barely remembering the brush of his warm lips upon her brow. When Irina opened her eyes again, the dark of the night had begun to recede as the morning's light seeped through the curtains. Moving her arm, blindly searching for him, she found the other side of the bed empty and growing cold in Max's absence. Scanning the room, taking note of its quiet, she realized Max had departed. "Oh, God, he can't leave, not now." She gulped. "I need him." She wouldn't be able to survive without him. Irina slid out of the bed, and she noticed the light flickering off of something on the coffee table. Hurrying over, she plucked it up and exhaled. A golden heart-shaped locket. He left this as payment. Laying the necklace back down on the table, she jammed her bare feet into her shoes by the door, and wrapping herself in the shawl, she bolted outside in hopes of catching Max before it was too late. The street was uncharacteristically empty, save for a lone retreating figure at the far end of the road. He was ambling toward the rising sun as though he were heading toward heaven. "Max!" Irene mouthed his name and sprinted after him. When she reached him, she grabbed his elbow and spun him around. "What are you doing? Where do you think you are going?" she demanded. Max was trembling from head to toe, a result of the blood loss, and wearing only a tattered shirt and slacks on a crisp early morning. Beads of sweat broke out across his brow. He was too weak to go off on his own. Max wouldn't make it, not in his compromised condition. His wound drained him, body and soul. "Come on back. Come on, come back." Irene linked her arm through his and led him back toward the cottage. "Irene, you do not have to do this." Max protested, though he was too weak to put up much resistance. "You have already done enough." "Hush." Irene stubbornly shook her head. "Come with me." Reaching for his hand, she led him back to the cottage. She guided Max into bed. Patting his fevered brow with a damp cloth, she whispered, "Try and rest." Max's eyes watered. "Irene, no." He struggled to sit up, but she nudged him back down. "Irene, if the Nazis find me hiding here, they will kill us both. Let's not worry about that now. Just rest, Max. We will figure everything out later." She caressed the side of his jaw, pressed a kiss to his cheek, and took her seat once more by the bedside while he rested. Irene let out a weary sigh and crossed herself. Max was right. If the Nazis did discover him, they both would be taken out into the street and executed, hung or shot. Most likely shot. The Nazis liked to shed blood. Irene heard by word of mouth that Poland was the only country in which hiding Jews was punishable by death. However, if she turned him over to the Gestapo herself, she would have 500 zlotys to her name. Not a fortune, but it would mean she would not have to work herself to death or steal or sleep with her employer for a little while. The locket should fetch her something too. Max had no family, so no one would miss him. In his condition, he would likely die anyway. Infection or pneumonia would set in. He might even have typhus, like his wife did. If he were on his own, the Germans would eventually discover him. "It's not as if I can hide him." Irene wrung her chapped hands, her throat thickening. She couldn't support them both on her wages. Reporting him to the Gestapo now would be a small mercy. It was better this way, so he wouldn't suffer long. Poor man. Max didn't deserve betrayal. That's exactly what it was. But if anyone was to survive this war, it was going to be her. I will survive one way or another. Irene dressed quietly and put on her coat. Remembering the locket, she stuffed it in her coat pocket. She crept over to Max's sleeping form, and bending over, she brushed her lips against his cheek. "I will be back soon," she murmured near his ear. He smiled in his sleep, blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. Irene left the cottage and headed in the direction of the Gestapo headquarters, disregarding the guilt weighing her down. She would confess it to the priest later and be absolved. God would understand. And now the discussion questions. Number 1. Do you judge Irene negatively for her decision to turn Max in for a reward? Are there additional things you could learn about Irene and her experiences in the war that would change your mind or excuse her actions? Number 2. Does a person have a first duty to keep themselves alive and only a second duty to help others? Would this even apply to Irene, or is her situation not desperate enough? Number 3. Does it matter that Irene went and brought Max back to her house and only later decided to turn him in? Would it be worse if she brought him back in order to turn him in? The end result is the same. Number 4. What would you have done in Irene's situation? As a percent, how sure are you that you know what you would have done if you were actually in the same situation? And 5. Is it fair to judge someone else's choices based on a type of decision we have never had to make? If not, then why do we do it? We've been reading In Love and War by Veronica Leigh. Next week, we'll be reading Taps by Paul Hilding. If you enjoyed this story, head over to our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, and listen to our discussions of this and other short stories from our magazine. We will include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage in the comment section or on our Facebook page. Thank you for joining us. And until next time.